St. John Bosco would say anything he could think of to help the boys understand his point during sermons, even if it meant preaching about monkeys. He wasn't above using seemingly childlike parables for sermons, even for adults, as long as it helped to illustrate the point, much like our Lord's parable about the lilies of the field. The Miracles and Prophecies of St. John Bosco, a project of America Needs Fatima. I'm your host, Matthew Miller. Subscribe for new episodes every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. In September 1850, Don Bosco arranged for 130 boys to make a 7-day retreat at the minor seminary in Giovanni, which was normally empty during the summer vacation. The oratory boarders and a sizable contingent of boys from the 3 festive oratories obtained permission from their families or their employers and made the journey on foot. Don Bosco had providentially obtained a generous donation from the Society of St. Paul to cover the expenses of the retreat. He had arranged for 2 other priests to preach besides himself and asked a third to help with confessions. To make the retreat as helpful to as many souls as possible, the inhabitants of the town were also invited to participate, and many took advantage of the opportunity. Everyone fondly remembered the fatherly care Don Bosco showed to them and to all the boys on that occasion, patiently bearing with the youthful thoughtlessness of many, but insisting upon and obtaining silence and attention at the appointed times. Of course, there were very many happy and joyful recreation periods, which was what most of the boys looked forward to. But during these recreation periods, Don Bosco was mostly interested in finding out what the boys had learned from the sermons. On one occasion, as he was surrounded by many boys, some of whom were from the local parish, he asked about the topic of his morning's instruction. He had discussed how to not give scandal in speech, word, or deed. Keep in mind that when St. John Bosco was a boy, he could memorize the sermon word for word. The first boy he singled out didn't know. The second seemed embarrassed, so Don Bosco questioned a few more. The youngsters scratched their heads but could give no satisfactory reply. "Oh my," exclaimed Don Bosco. "Was I talking Chinese, or were you all asleep?" Then one of the smaller boys piped up, "Wait, I remember." "What do you remember?" "Oh, I remember the monkeys." Don Bosco had told them a tale. A peddler was going from village to village trying to sell his wares, which he carried in a small display case strapped to his shoulders. However, night overtook him before he reached a certain town. It was summer. The pale moon shone in the sky, and the peddler, weary after his long trek, decided to spend the night under a large tree. He opened his case, and taking out a white cap, of which he had quite a good supply, he put it on his head as protection against the evening chill and fell asleep. There were a number of monkeys up in that tree. The sight of a man sleeping with a white cap aroused their instincts. One of them slipped down very quietly, poked around in the box which had been left open, pulled out a cap, put it on its head, and climbed the tree again. The other monkeys did likewise, and their mischievousness ended only when they had emptied the box entirely. The merchant slept peacefully throughout the night, and so did the monkeys. With white caps on their heads, they were quite a sight. At dawn, the merchant arose and prepared to resume his journey. Imagine his amazement and grief at seeing that all his caps had been stolen. "I've been robbed," he cried. "I'm ruined." But on second thought, realizing that only the caps were missing, he came to the conclusion that it couldn't have been a robbery. "I don't understand it," he told himself. Just then, he chanced to glance upward. "Ah," he cried, "look at the rascals." He tried to frighten them into returning his wares by flinging stones at them, but the monkeys merely leaped lightly from branch to branch, holding on to their caps. After many useless efforts, the poor peddler clutched his hair in utter despair and angrily flung the cap he was wearing to the ground. The monkeys instantly did likewise, and down rained the white caps to the delight of the harassed peddler. Don Bosco had drawn the moral that boys behave much in the same way as monkeys. If they see others doing good, they also do it. If they see someone do evil, they imitate it even more quickly. He had concluded by stressing the utter need of setting an edifying example for boys and of keeping them far away from any scandal. Upon realizing that the boys barely remembered certain points he had made in his sermons, Don Bosco took great pains thereafter to intersperse his sermons with concrete examples and parables to capture their imagination, and by this means to enlighten their minds and stir their hearts. He found this approach very effective. His preaching was animated with ardent concern for the salvation of souls. One day he was so moved by his own words that he broke into sobs and had to step down from the pulpit. Humbly and with some embarrassment, he remarked to Ascanio Savio, "I just couldn't control myself." He had to give voice to what was in his heart. But the effect on his young listeners was beyond words. On the last day, as a reward for their cooperation, Don Bosco took them on a grand hike to St. Michael's Abbey and Shrine, which involved a climb up a steep mountain road. It was an unforgettable hike with a beautiful view. This retreat also gave some boys a clearer insight into Don Bosco's singular virtues. He used to suggest special prayers, or even vows on occasion, to those who came to him to obtain cures or other favors from God. Young Felix Revilio had been suffering for several months from malaria. It had so undermined his health that the doctors had declared him to be consumptive. Don Bosco brought him to Giovanni along with the others for the retreat. Revilio himself told us that, after his confession, Don Bosco suggested that he make a vow to go to confession every week during the succeeding 6 months. At the same time, he suggested additional acts of devotion. This advice proved more helpful than all the medicines he had been taking, and in a short time, the boy recovered completely. Another young man, whose name we shall not disclose, he was one of the oldest at the Oratory, about 27, also made this spiritual retreat. One morning he walked into the sacristy, just as Don Bosco was about to go to the altar for Mass. Joseph Brosio, holding the missal, was ready to serve, when this fellow rudely snatched it from him and rushed out. Don Bosco, ever prompt to forgive, saw Brosio flush with anger, and he motioned him with a look to restrain himself. After Mass, he took Brosio aside and said, "It was good of you to yield. You'll soon see what kind of fellow he is." Unfortunately, Don Bosco had guessed correctly. Shortly thereafter, this young man stopped going to the Oratory. He joined the heretical sect of the Waldensians, and he often prowled about the Oratory to frighten the boys away from Don Bosco. But the saint had already informed Brosio of the young ruffian's conduct and asked him to be on the lookout. One day he showed up at the playground gate, armed with a long stiletto which he was prepared to use on anyone trying to bar his way. A young boy ran to call Brosio, while the rest, greatly terrified, raced to safety. Brosio walked up to him and asked him to leave, at first gently, and then in sterner language. Words were of no avail, for the man was drunk and obviously ready for a fight. Therefore, Brosio wisely withdrew and watched him from a safe distance. It wasn't long thereafter that the ruffian fell into the hands of the law. Don Bosco, called to testify against him, requested that the charges be dropped. He merely asked the court that police protection be provided for himself and the boys of the Oratory. The culprit was subsequently banished from Turin. Thank you all so much for watching, and if you'd like to hear about St. John Bosco's prophetic ability to know what questions were going to be asked for tests at school when he was a young boy, just click on the video here. God bless you, and Our Lady keep you.